Robert Caulk. I'm CEO of Emergent Methods, and I take my coffee black.
Knowledge graphs. We're talking knowledge graphs today with Rob. Welcome back to the MLOps Community Podcast. I'm your host, Dimitrios, and just as it says on the tin, we are all about them knowledge graphs. The conversation with Rob centered around how he ingests thousands of news sources, how he uses a combination of vector search, keyword search, LLMs, AI, and of course, knowledge graphs to give two sides to every news story. I thought it was fascinating, especially when he went into the part about spinning up very small knowledge graphs for the end user and then blowing them up when the user is done with the query. As always, if you like it, tell one friend. That's all we ask. And last but not least, there's a really cool initiative going on in the MLOps community, which is you can, if you want, just meet somebody else in the MLOps community. We're doing curated intros. So if you want to do that, reach out to me because you get to meet somebody else in the MLOps community that is also looking for a new friend. And you can choose. Do you want to meet somebody that's about your same seniority level or maybe higher? Maybe you want somebody like a mentor. And I think that is really cool. I got to give a shout out to the folks that are running that initiative. This is all Benoit's brainchild. We've got about 90 people doing it right now, and only 2 people have not repeated in doing it after the second round. So we've done these twice already, 2 different rounds of introductions. 2 people said no, they didn't do it, but that was only because they couldn't meet, and so they didn't have the time for it. If you want to do it, hit me up. We'll make sure it happens. And let's jump into this conversation. Knowledge graphs and the ontology. You said there's kind of some hot takes you got.
Start with saying, hey, I'm Rob. I'm the founder of Ask News, and we're building this data source, which is a real-time data source for news. And I'm sure I'll chat a bunch about that, but we kind of stumbled into knowledge graphs and stumbled into ontologies, and so probably our opinion has some temporal bias, right? Because depending on when you enter one of these domains, you have some bias about the latest. It's kind of like if you're young and you are listening to a song that's actually a remake of a song from the 80s, but the first one you heard is the new one, and then you hear the original one, you're like, it's
Yeah.
just not so good. It's
Not
kind
the
of the
same.
same when it comes to some of these
Ontology.
AI domains. And so we stumbled into, do we build an ontology for this massive news knowledge graph that we're building, or do we go ontology free? And at the end of the day, all the signs pointed to ontology free because of our end user and what they needed from it. Doesn't mean that the ontologies don't have a great use case still and always will, but when you enter this new world of AI interactions with AI, interactions with people, and trying to convey information. And it's very different from interacting with a graph database in 2018, when it was, hey, back then with an ontology, I've got my Trump is a part of this article, which is a part of this publication, which was published on this day in this month. That's like an ontology, and you could potentially navigate through to get to other people a part of similar. But then when you're trying to convey information quickly to a journalist or analyst or another LLM, you're missing some of the high resolution relationships at that point. Trump is a part of this article, which is a part of this publisher, and Biden is a part of this article, which is also a part of the publisher, or maybe he's a part of the same article, but you don't really know how Trump and Biden relate. And that's
Interesting.
where we've stumbled into, what if we go ontology free and let the relationships kind of form themselves? And
Wait, and
so,
can you explain what the difference is there? So ontology is just basically all the metadata around the certain subject or
exactly.
whatever it is that you're looking at.
Yeah. So, traditional ontology would be a very structured knowledge representation of your domain. It might be your company, it might be whatever domain you're trying to model. And it by, having the strict metadata definitions like you're saying, it allows you to quickly traverse and quickly filter efficiently really large swaths of data because you've done that metadata filtering and you've assigned relationships which are not assignable in any other way besides knowing that they have similar metadata. So, you know, that's great, but it misses but you have these very defined relationships. Trump is a part of this article. This article was published on this day. So published on is defined, a part of is defined, the article type, the person. But what about like, Trump defeated Kamala, right? Defeated. Now you have to add a new relationship. You have to then add that into your ontology and be ready for it at all times. But
Um,
then you kind of bring that to the limit case, and it's just an unlimited number of possible relationships between people, organizations. You know, Kamala can be a part of the Democratic Party. Trump can be a part of the whatever MAGA, and so by kind of leveraging this high level rat reasoning and intelligence, which LLMs have now ushered in, you can now start defining relationships in a high resolution. And of this, there's a big weakness, and we'll talk about that, but there's a big strength. The strength is with this high resolution, I can now look at a very small piece of my graph and quickly consume that information as an analyst or pass that to an LLM in a very, very prompt token optimized way, right? Because
right.
instead of a full paragraph, which is like, oh, Kamala got defeated by Trump and then Trump joined MAGA, blah, 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 all these extra nouns and verbs. Instead, it's literally a JSON structure passed to an LLM. You've now reduced your token usage and you've actually magnified the most important relationships for the LLM to move forward on to glean insights. So now you're just working in a much different world than the previous 2018 ontology structures. So it doesn't it's almost just a different type of approach. But
Yeah.
the guys that are using traditional knowledge graphs and ontologies, they haven't quite, grasped this idea that maybe there is a new use case for knowledge graphs that wasn't quite so useful back then. And so that, I mean, I don't know if that clarifies the question.
Yeah, it's basically you're giving high definition relationships in a way, as opposed to lots of noise, and you have to filter through all that noise to get what you're looking for. You're trying to say, what are the most important relations that we have with whatever the subject is? And then we can filter from there. And I guess the main thing that comes to my mind is how you were saying you have almost infinite or infinite minus one amount of relations and edge cases where there's just that long tail of relations that you can have when you're doing it the ontology way. How does noun with no ontology void that?
Void the how does it void what? The
The like
use.
infinite relations problem, or do you still have that
Yeah,
infinite
so the
relation?
infinite relations problem means that your database is just kind of screwed if you're going to try to model it with the same type of database, right? Because the graph databases are not designed to handle an infinite number of relationships coming in because they're indexing in a way that allows you to filter. So you have to approach the problem from a different side if you're going to do something like this, which means a hierarchy of databases, and some of them are not graph databases at all, right? And so, for us, a lot of what we do is just storing a lot of high fidelity information, and then building that into, and then putting that into a graph database with a finite number of relationships, and then traversing around. So, you know, you're looking at the world's largest news knowledge graph sitting on S3 more or less, and then using some traditional traversals or traditional indexing and retrieval methodologies, and then finding, okay, this is the part I want, because nobody wants to view a million relationships all in one graph. It's just useless.
Yeah.
Um, so that's how you kind of solve it. Then you can cache it. And I don't, I mean, I don't work at all with MEM Graph, but I'll plug them. It's a great cache of a data. It's almost like designed for this use case because it's designed to be run in memory, and that allows you to do very high performance cache movement in and out very quickly. So you're still interacting with the data as if you in the same type of queries, but you're not having to deal with that massive infinite number of relationships, if it makes sense.
Uh-huh. Actually, I've heard MEM Graph being mentioned before, and the way that I think I heard it described was that it's almost like a DuckDB of graph databases. Is so what are the benefits there of MEM Graph? It's just small and fast and, like, why do you like it?
Well, I like it because it's open source fully.
Yeah.
A lot of you get involved in Neo4j. It's really geared at funneling you to enterprise,
Yeah.
and I come from an open source background, so everything we do is open source and everything we consume is open source. And then getting, if Neo4j's enterprise product really actually was compelling, then okay, I get it. But MemGraph's open source is actually compelling and fully functional. There are some additional features, as always, but generally speaking, like Quadrant, the base database that is open source is extremely usable in production. So to me, that's a big distinction. But the underlying design, and I'm really not an engineer expert. I haven't even reviewed their source code or anything, but what I know from my bird's eye view of it and reading docs and community and interacting with their community, yeah, they've really focused on performance, so using in memory. And so, I mean, the difference between storing stuff in memory and disk, it's going to be a lot faster. And Neo4j keeps everything on disk. It's using cache most likely, but MemGraph took kind of the reverse approach. It said everything's in memory. And now if you want to try to store stuff on disk, it's kind of a feature. And people do want to do that as well for much larger graphs. But MemGraph, I think, kind of caught on to the idea that you don't actually need a massive graph. What you
Yeah.
really want is the right graph. And that can be constituted of, 100 nodes. But as long as it's the right graph, and then you can traverse it and filter it the right way, it becomes very valuable. And doing it quickly and on the fly, like we're doing, loading stuff in, deleting it. Like we'll literally create a database and then just delete it, right? Because when we're done with it, we're done with it. So
Wow.
it's a really interesting use case of it fits really well in that paradigm.
Yeah, it's ephemeral, in that
Exactly.
sense. Okay, I like that, and it makes
Yeah.
sense why it's in a way, you can compare it to DuckDB and because it's more like, yeah, small graphs. You don't need to boil the ocean. You just need the graphs that are important for you and for the time that it's important for you, and then you're done. And it almost reminds me of Redis too, how they took that approach of, hey, let's cache things, let's make it in memory, let's make it really fast, and let's get you what you need. If that's your use case, then go for it.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think it's a really fun time to watch all of the different databases and services choose their features, and even us as a company trying to choose what we offer. And that's what I realized is the most difficult aspect of interacting in the AI industry right now is deciding, what people appear to want, but what people might actually need. And that is a really difficult thing to connect. So I admire MemGraph for kind of taking a slightly uh non-conventional route a while ago. Even before AI, they were pushing this sort of, but there's this other aspect of data graph DBs where maybe you don't even need them depending on what you're really doing. You can still do graph rag without a graph DB. And that's where I think I'm watching the ecosystem to see where that goes because the graph DB itself is very expensive to run. It is very computationally expensive, and if you can get away without it, it's kind of like it's much better for graph rag, especially for speed and stuff. So that's part of the industry. I don't know how it's gonna go. I would love to watch and see what they do.
But how do you even envision that happening, and what makes you think that it's moving in that direction and that's a possibility in the future?
I mean, at the end of the day, you can simulate a graph database with Postgres tables, right? And and linked lists. It's more about what the GraphDB does is it makes that multi-hop query really nice and easy and fluid, and the UI is there and computationally effective. The index itself has prepared you for these multi-hops. But truly, all you're just connecting metadata on documents, right? And so you could build a GraphDB in Postgres. A lot of people do it, and if you don't have that demand of these very complex queries, you might actually be better off with just Postgres, which is wild to think about, right? Because we're in this world of like everyone says, "Oh, vector DBs, graph DBs,
Yeah.
um, NoSQL DBs, all of the, and then
Uh-huh.
add the vectors to the NoSQL, add the graph to the vector." Like, it's just like at some point, you sometimes you can actually simplify things a little bit by just saying, "Hey, this is my metadata. I have 4 points of metadata. I want to be able to do a couple hops. I don't need to do something wild, so maybe I just custom engineer it." Maybe that's how RAG goes, especially if RAG becomes a super domain specific industry, or not industry, but like use case of
Yeah.
every time you need to engage RAG, you're doing it from with domain expertise of engineering behind it. And so in that case, if you had to do some engineering, and maybe it made sense to not deal with a really heavy database and instead do something more niche, even with Redis. I don't know.
Yeah. It's so funny. It reminds me of that meme of the nitwit and the ninja, and how it starts over here and it's like, "Oh, I'll just use Postgres." And then there's the bell curve
Exactly.
graph and it's like, "No, we need vector database and graph
Yeah.
database and NoSQL." And then on the other side, you have the ninja who's like, "I'll just use Postgres."
Yeah, exactly. Postgres is one of the best inventions, I think, of the last 20 years because no, I mean,
But
I
big
think it
statement.
replaced Oracle, generally speaking,
Yeah.
and Oracle was this miserable vendor lock-in. I still have friends in the industry, and their whole job is trying to migrate away from Oracle for
Job
years.
security right there.
It's absolute insanity. So yeah, I agree with this meme. But we
Yeah.
do use vector database. I don't wanna,
Yeah.
hate on vector
You're
databases or
kinda
even
talking
graph
in the
DBs.
future. This is, where you're thinking maybe there's a potential here, let's see, and if you can, then great, but at this moment in time, you don't, and, that's really good to call out. It also reminds me when you talk about Oracle and migrating off of it, there was an episode of Acquired that I listened to on AWS,
Yeah.
and I think it wasn't until 2018 that they had fully migrated completely off of Oracle. 2018 for AWS, and, well, I guess AWS or Amazon, it probably was because AWS probably started a lot on AWS stuff, and so you can imagine how hard it must be for folks to get off of Oracle. So anyone that is out there and completely locked in Oracle, you're fighting the good fight.
Yeah. Join the Postgres world.
Yeah. They're like, you're oblivious to all these pains that I have. So anyway, the let's talk about what you are actually doing as opposed to what is potential in a utopia world where we can just use Postgres for everything, because it feels like, as you were saying, you have many layers of databases, and the actual structure around that and the way that the queries go through each layer of these is kind of interesting to me.
Yeah, and there's a lot of engineering behind it, which is super fun to be a part of and to solve in real time. I mean, one of it kind of, if we back up to how we generate the data, it might help understand how the data is structured and then queried. We're doing a lot of processing of news, and that each for each news article, we're extracting and enriching as much information as we can to build a synthetic representation. So we're not actually dealing with the full text ever. We're going and we're extracting evidence, we're extracting the key people, we're extracting the the geo coordinates, right, related to the locations that are mentioned in the thing. We're extracting all sorts of stuff, including relationships. And so that happens for every single article. And that means, one article might mention Joseph R. Biden, and the other article might mention President Biden, and the other one might mention just Biden.
Yeah.
And obviously, that is one node. or maybe it's not, depending on what you want in your system, right? And so being able to choose how those nodes are disambiguated is huge. But the generation of that data itself, since we're going ontology free and we're saying, okay, we're extracting a person from this article, he might have a different name from this article. We had to figure out how to do this and build up from it. That aspect we fine tuned Phi3 Mini in order to build the graphs. And I'm happy to chat about how we did that after. But basically, Phi3 Mini has one job, and that's to just take a text and generate an ontology free graph. And so it does it for this article, Joseph R. Biden, this article, Biden, this article, President Biden. And then, we store all of that information in, a hierarchy of databases in some ways, right? A lot of UUIDs pointing to different UUIDs. Maybe it's too complex. I don't know. But it seems to work quite well. But a lot of the data is stored in S3. And so we're doing retrieval on these UUIDs based on a lot of pretty traditional techniques, to be completely honest. I mean, we do have vector representations there, but keyword search is still really, really good. I think that's
Can get pretty
something that's
far.
maybe also a little contentious these days, that maybe you don't actually need these dense vectors. You might not even need sparse vectors.
Mm.
So even with just basic keyword metadata filtering, you can get so far to just get to the base of, okay, here's an article that has Biden, Biden, Biden. And then you
Uh-huh.
can take those graphs and you can start doing your disambiguations on top of them and then put it into a MEM graph. And then you can do traversals where you're not dealing with 3 nodes, which are clearly all the same person. Now you have 1 node, but you managed it's almost like a decompression or a compression of information. So it's decompressed at that base layer. And then you have a decompression algorithm, which inside of it is a disambiguation. And so that really helps with solving these big challenges on the largest news knowledge graph in the world. Once you're in MEM graph, you can have all the fun you want with whatever queries you want, and then and even filter it down even further if you want.
And so why is it that you were saying that the mem graphs were spun up and then blown up in moments? Like, where is that? What does the life cycle of the mem graph look
Yeah.
like?
Good question. So when our users come in and they want to interact with this knowledge graph, right? We're taking their query and we're saying, okay, how do we build a graph for this person from what we know here? So there is actually some AI on the incoming side, because they're not using traditional query languages for the graph. They're just using natural English language. And so it's on us to say, okay, these are some important keywords we're going to use for filtering. These are some important concepts that we should keep in place. And so then we go fetch all that information, do all of the combination, and we can actually put that into a mem graph instance for them right then and there. And
Mm.
then at that point, we can actually use traditional queries. And we also have already prepared a traditional graph query based on what they asked. So maybe they said, give me all of the relationships of Biden within 3 hops. That's it. And then tell me what's the biggest threat to Biden's administration based on 3 hops or something, right? Something that is clearly English language, requires a lot of basic retrieval and the construction of some real query. And so then once it's in memgraph, we can do that actual query. And spinning up the memgraph is actually quite fast, right? So I know we kind of hated on GraphDBs, but when you're at the scale of what these users are looking for, they're not looking to build a massive graph. They want to know, usually there's a time constraint as well. So you're only looking at the graph between, now and the last 72 hours or even the last week. And no one would say, I want the graph for the last 2 years, because it would probably break memgraph anyways. And so, but it also is just too much data to even parse and try to glean insights from. Usually what you want to know is like what was happening with Biden right before a certain event. So that would be an analyst saying, okay, leading up to Biden exiting the race, I wanna know all of the people within 3 hops that said something related to Biden exiting, and then give me a summary of all of those interactions and tell me who are the most likely individuals that contributed to maybe influencing Biden or influencing the media or whatever kind of analytics insight you're after.
Yeah.
That would basically we would take that and then have to do this whole decompression, get it here, extract it for you, and also even give them access directly to that MEM graph instance to then maybe build their own queries, right? And
Uh,
as soon as they're done, we wipe it clear. We're done with it, right? We're
Interesting.
at that point, there's nothing more for us to do. That graph will never need to be created again because someone else is going to have a slightly different query. And as you can see, this like decompression has so many, you know, I guess reasoning checkpoints that it most likely won't happen again. We do have some caching, but it's very, very limited in this sense.
Yeah. And so when you're loading up the information into the mem graph for the user to be able to interact with, how do you know what is enough if they don't put how many hops? Or also, how are you not grabbing things that may or may not be relevant or may be relevant for the next query? Is that also just loaded in this time when someone says, okay, and I want to go a little bit deeper over here, or I'm going to poke around in this area, then you just grab that data and serve it up?
So you mean like modifying an existing graph is what you're
Yeah. So
saying?
there's exactly, it's like I modifying an existing graph, or I want to know how you are creating the surface area of the graph, because I'm assuming that not everyone says, give me 3 hops. Or
Yeah, exactly.
do you have to say that, or is that like one of the prerequisites? No.
No, I mean, luckily we can kind of decompress from anything. It's on you to decide what level of structure and specificity you're after. It could be there's irrelevant things that are connected, but they're gonna be connect. There's gonna be a connection, right? Like you might have, if we're talking about this like presidential thing, it's like okay, here's Biden floating here, and then like a couple hops over here, you've got some random sporting event that had nothing to do with it, but there was like a mention of something related to something in the anthem, and then just this weird connection. It might be floating
Yeah.
around, but in some ways, that is actually what a lot of our analysts are after because that's
Uh,
where you get to something, a connection that's hard to get to through vector search because you've got this very, very dissonant connection set of connections.
yeah.
Like, for example, one of our favorite clients is Love Justice. They
Uh,
do they combat human trafficking, so it's an NGO in South Africa, and what they do is that, like, they'll say, "Okay, I know there was this incident of, there was an incident of criminal activity at this shop, and this person reported an incident, and the police are investigating it." But then this shop is also connected to this one person over here. And that person might be benign, but it turns out that they're also connected to something over here, which basically opens up, okay, why is this person, it really, they follow this path through and all of a sudden they've kind of uncovered a hidden insight. And that allows them to then say, hey, this is somebody or something or some place or some product that we need to look into because it's weirdly connected. So that's essentially the one of the use cases you would use the knowledge graph for. But so
it
the
reminds me
surface,
of
sorry, I've kind of drifted off the surface area, but
no, it's okay,
it's
it's
kind of
okay.
you get what you get, and you hope that that raw representation and that this metadata filtering is going to get you enough of a surface area that then you can play a lot with once you're in MEM graph. So maybe it's a weakness, maybe it's a strength.
Yeah. It reminds me of that moment in the series The Wire. I don't know if you ever saw that, but there was, I can't remember in which season it was, but all of the police are sitting around in their stakeout room trying to figure out how the drug dealers have money or who is giving money to who, when it comes to this drug dealer is supplying the streets with drugs, but then it's like the money is going into all of these accounts, and then one of these accounts actually, what's going on here? They're following the money and they see that it's going to a politician. And it feels like, damn, dude, if they just had Ask News, they could have made that whole episode like 30 minutes shorter.
Exactly. That's funny that you say that actually. Who's that guy, Matt Gaetz? And the New York Times released an article when Matt Gaetz was the nominee for the head of the Justice Department.
Uh-huh.
They people all of the dirty laundry was coming out as usual, but one of the dirty laundry pieces from his interactions with minors was apparently the investigation into him, they built a Venmo payment knowledge graph. Did you see this?
No.
And it was just so damning. It was like Gates pays this guy a lot, and this guy pays all the minors a lot. And it was just, but then it was sometimes he would even pay the minors directly. And it was like, man, and then he would put little notes like for tuition. Like you couldn't make a better knowledge graph set of metadata than use Venmo and add notes like for tuition from Gates to. So I think people are missing the power of the graphs, especially people like that, like Gates. But you've got companies that are designed for using the power of graphs just to solve these criminal investigations. Like
Yeah.
one of our advisors, Paco Nathan. I don't know, you know him, right? I
Oh,
think
yeah,
we
we
were
had
connected
Paco
to
on
him.
here. That's
Awesome.
great. Yeah, yeah, Paco's awesome. He's a legend in this space and just
Did
in AI in general.
he really is. Did he tell you about what Sensing's doing and what they're
No.
man, that's crazy. They're a lot of what they'll do is, even like, they use open source intelligence. They do a lot of disambiguation, and what they're able to do is open up insights through knowledge graph connections that are just totally hidden when tracking criminal activity, and some of that comes down to, you know, even imagery for I think one of the examples he gave was like fishing, protecting the oceans from overfishing and stuff, and you can use imagery and you can
Yeah.
use, information from ports, and you can use boat registrations, and you can connect all of that stuff, and all of a sudden you start to see this boat is doing something that is weird, is connected to this thing, um and then besides that, my one of my favorite examples was the Silk Road investigation, how they found the creator of Silk Road. You know Silk
I didn't
Road
hear.
from
Yeah, yeah, I know. I've for
yeah,
sure have heard of Silk Road. It was a drug marketplace, right?
yeah, and it was based on Bitcoin, and
Uh-huh.
essentially the way that the feds, the FBI identified the creator and found him was by mapping out all of the wallet addresses and the movement of money between wallets. And I think Cosmograph even has the Silk Road investigation available like on their website to
Wow.
visualize.
Just to
And it's
play with?
really cool. You see all the wallet addresses floating around, and that's basically through these connections they were able to say, okay, this wallet is showing up a lot in these very, very suspicious payment transactions, or there's a wallet that's suspicious, and the way people glean information from knowledge graphs, once you start seeing it, you realize, okay, there's a lot of power, and that is with ontologies. So there's
Okay.
definitely still good use case for ontologies.
And you mentioned how AI is on the front end when the user interacts and their queries, but then you also have AI on the back end. When you're sending queries to an LLM, how does where does everywhere in the besides the Phi 3, which is awesome use case of just fine tuning Phi 3, and that's very cool to hear you did that. Did you distill the when you fine tuned it? How did you fine tune it?
Oh, we have a blog post I can post as a comment on the podcast, but yeah,
Nice.
we fine tuned it. A lot of it was engineering the data set. We pretty much did a knowledge transfer from GPT 4.0. So, which is not new. I think even back in the day, Alpaca was like the first to show that, hey, you could actually steal some of this knowledge from ChatGPT or from GPT 3.5 back in the day. Um, And now we basically did the same thing except with GPT-4o to label a bunch of data, engineer that data in a very diversified way to cover the parameter space as best as we can. The parameter space that we knew we would be looking in, which is, ensuring you have topics of politics, sports, entertainment, ensuring you're hitting all the languages, ensuring that you're, you know, crossing all the different continents and countries and sources and stuff like that. So labeling that data set with GPT-4o, ensuring it's diversified, and then fine-tuning Phi 3 on it. And it turns out it outperforms Claude 3.5, and it's free and fast, right? So
Wow.
if we were to run on Claude 3.5, you'd get great results. But imagine putting 500,000 articles a day through Claude 3.5, you'd pay
A
probably
lot.
10K a day.
Yeah.
And I'm not even kidding. And so all of a sudden you've got this little tiny one that fits on basically a consumer graphics card, and it's just pumping out Claude level quality. Of course, it's not going to do anything else, right? It's only going to build the graphs, but they're better than Claude graphs, which is fun. But okay, so to answer the end of your question, which is one of my favorite reasons, or one of the actual main impetus for taking this whole ontology free route, was the conveying information in a very concise and token optimized way. So like you said, what happens on the end with the AI? Like, why are you now we're trying to communicate to an LLM. So a lot of our users might not even need the MEM graph component of this. So a lot of them will say, I need a graph of Biden's interactions and related to Hunter Biden or whatever. And so then we build them this very, very concise representation of relationships, and then they'll take that as JSON or YAML, and then they'll just hand that directly in a prompt to an LLM and continue with their insights, right? So they'll say, maybe we're just part of their chain. We're not the beginning
Oh,
nor the end. We're just one component, getting them that real time grounding. But instead of, in order to build that relationship graph of Biden and Hunter, probably we had to read 1,000, 2,000 articles, distill them, enrich them, understand them, build relationships. And now it's all been condensed into maybe 3 or 400 tokens. And so they're saving a ton of money there. I mean, they're paying us because obviously they pay for the request, but they don't have to do any of that aggregation of information. What if a Chinese outlet talked about Biden randomly? How
yeah.
would you have gotten that, right? And
Yeah.
doing all this in under a second too, and passing that to the next AI or to the next LM, and then maybe appending after. So like their prompt might look like this. So they get the YAML or the relationship graph from us. They add it to the beginning of their prompt and they say, here's the relationships related to the news of Biden and Hunter. And then here's my other context that only I know about, right? In my own application related to this piece of whatever to help answer the user query. And here's another set of context. They're painting their own context. We're just a part of it, but now their context window is basically fully open. They didn't have to put a bunch of articles in it. They didn't have to pre-process all this text. It's just
Oh,
boom,
yeah.
JSON. And so, and the LLM loves interacting with it. The other beautiful part of this is that this is the innovation of us connecting publishers in a very, very equitable way to LLMs, because now the original expression is nowhere to be found. There's no plagiarism concerns, but the publishers can still monetize the information that they've produced without worrying about leaking all of that information and leaking all of their, not leaking the information, but not leaking the original expression that their journalists spend so much time writing.
Yeah.
And they don't want to train new foundation models with their expression, with their real, with the
Their
full
style of
text,
writing. Yeah.
but they want to monetize it in this new AI world, and they don't know how. So Ask News essentially locks them in and says, okay, come to us. If you surface, you get a royalty. And what surfaces is a synthetic contextual representation where, like, you've surfaced somehow, but in a lot of context with a lot of other information. You just contributed to this query, so you get a royalty,
Oh,
but there's nothing there
nice.
that's going to get trained on or stolen or redisplayed on another website. It's only for communication to LLMs.
Wow. Wow, there's
We're
so much
super
there,
excited.
and you're saying everything that I like to hear. There's so
Nice.
many cool things. that you're talking about here. And the first thing, let me start from what my mind instantly jumped to was, oh, you're just for a lot of your users' use cases is you're just another step in a DAG. And
Exactly.
it's like, go grab the context from Ask News, and then they can use that however they choose. Maybe it's by putting it into a context window for their LLM call, or maybe it's just to have some more information to play with when they want to go and they want to play with that information. And then number two is it is so nice that you're doing the heavy lifting to synthesize all that data and then find what the real signal is out of all of that. Because yeah, thousands of news sources, I can imagine that some of them are really bad and some of them don't mean anything and some of them are actually quite good. So how do you know which ones are good or bad, or do all of the people get paid equally? So
Yeah,
I
good.
can start churning out shitty things and start getting paid on Ask News because I'm not known for my quality.
That's a good question. And that's one of the most common questions we get, and that's all. I like how people are aware of the dangers around potentially propagating misinformation. And this one is super interesting because we've just been in the mix of it and we've been observing it and running research on it. And so one of the outlets that people hate that they might stumble across is RT, right? It's like, oh, this is a Russian propaganda network. Everything they say is fake. But actually, the beauty of what we're doing is this contextual representation. First of all, you can filter out RT if you don't want, right? You can say I don't
Okay.
want that, or but oh, even when you include RT, if you take a contextual picture of French, German, English, Italian, Arabic, and Russian outlets, and Ukrainian, to discuss the Ukrainian-Russian war, all of a sudden, the LLM is smart enough to detect what are the alignments and what is poking out and contradicting, right? And
Uh,
we're able to leverage the LLM's intelligence at that point. So, like the stories we write on Ask News, that's precisely what we do. We cluster a bunch of articles, and then we actually ensure we do what's called diversity enforcement. So RT might show up, but knowing how RT relates to what on the same topic to what the Ukrainian source says is actually the right piece of information to convey to the reader, because
yeah.
that shows up as a contradiction. It's like, oh, RT says that no civilians were killed. Every other source in every other language in every other part of the world says that a bunch of civilians were killed. That's just a piece of information that we are relaying. It was a contradiction that the LLM was able to identify because it poked out like a sore thumb. Now you as the reader, you decide what to do with that information. It helps you, it reinforces that RT might be reporting incorrectly. So if we remove RT from the whole interaction, now we're actually kind of biasing away from Russia. We're not giving Russia even a say. Sometimes what in an RT article, there might actually be really important information to know about in Russia.
Uh-huh.
Obviously there's that uh, understanding that it's coming from a state-run megaphone, and that should be a part of of how you consume that information. But a lot of times they're reporting actual events that are occurring, and knowing what they say is important. So, if you want to start publishing a bunch of articles that might surface in these queries, that's perfectly okay. That we would take in your public, like if you want to monetize your Substack, you can do that, right?
Yeah.
So you can come and add your Substack, and then we'll go and essentially build that synthetic relationship representation for you, leave your content there, and then make it retrievable for the developer. And if you said something that's retrievable, they can play with it. Um, the last point I would make on that, we have a ton of filtering mechanisms. So part of our enrichment, we check the reporting voice. So we'll check if it's persuasive, sensational, objective, investigative, analytical. So you could say, I only want objective. Some of our analysts say, I only want sensational, because they actually want to see what the sensational side of it. Maybe they only want sensational Russian to just understand only what, because that's the part of the context that they need to paint in their next step, right? Like, it's almost like a chosen bias with your filter where you can say, I only want this, I only want that. You can also filter on PageRank. This helps, right?
Wait, that sentiment analysis is done by another model in the background?
Yeah, actually, Llama 370B is running. Llama 3.170B is running basically the full synthetic representation, which includes, yeah, the reporting voice, the sentiment, the extraction of key evidence, supporting details, any key people, stuff like that. That would be kind of the synthetic representation. So, Llama 3.170B, you've played with it, right? I mean, it's wildly capable. Uh, and we see it works very well, especially when it comes to sentiment analysis, positive, neutral, negative. You see this like basically this massive shift when in comparison of the llama models versus what sentiment analysis was before. And it used to be very, very difficult to get that right. We're still not perfect, but this was a step change. This was going from 50% of the time right to 85% of the time right. Something where an analyst used to say, so many of our analysts and clients say, "You have sentiment analysis? I don't touch that." Like I've seen enough sentiment analysis. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been burned by them enough that I just don't wanna touch
Exactly.
this.
So we have to convince them. It's like, actually, we've done the research, we've done the checks. It's not perfect, but it's very, very Llama 3 has a high level reasoning. What does that mean when you have a higher level and you can do things like that? It's cool.
And so maybe you explained that then, but I didn't catch it the first time around. It's these news sources, you're crawling everywhere you can to get the news sources. You're then using Phi3 to figure out if there are nodes. And then when you figure out what the nodes are, you use Llama 3 to break it down?
Close. First, we aren't crawling everywhere. We're only crawling where we're allowed to crawl, or where we have a licensed source, or where someone has signed up voluntarily and given us the ability to go behind a paywall. So we'll
Uh,
never go behind a paywall. Um, Now, the construction of the information itself, actually, when we get to the article, Llama does its extraction, Phi3 does its extraction, Gliner does its extraction. We didn't talk about it, but this is a
what's Gliner?
this is a big pipeline. Gliner is like our crown jewel at Emergent Methods. It turns out it
Oh,
was
nice.
like the 10th most downloaded model on Hugging Face this year. I found this out through Clem's post, actually. He, like, they
Really?
have the 21 days of Hugging Face or whatever,
Yeah.
and day
Yeah.
2 was the most downloaded, and I was looking through. It's Gliner. It's just an entity extractor. We're not even really that brilliant. We didn't invent the architecture. We just engineered a data set which was diverse and fine-tuned it. So we're fine-tuners, we're not the architectural masters of transformers. It turns out it works very well and people caught on, but it's really cheap. These are all super cheap models, which is why you can kind of daisy chain them up. You can say, "Oh,
Uh,
yeah, Llama 3 is pretty cheap." I mean, it's most expensive one, but then Phi 3 is super cheap, Gliner super cheap, and that allows you to kind of really build out that synthetic contextual picture of a single article, and you do
uh-huh.
that for all of them. So every single article we find, we put it through that pipeline. So that sits now. Go ahead.
Which one? Okay, wait, so you have Llama 3 going first, and then it goes down the line, or is it all at the same time, like, asynchronously?
It depends. Some of them are async if they can be async. Like, I think the graph and the Gliner are async at the same time because they don't depend
Uh-huh.
on each other.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, Llama 3 goes first, and because Llama 3 gets you that full kind of distillation of information, and then you can start processing on top of it, which is really nice. It's it allows you to a lot of these small models like Gliner have a context window of 512 tokens. That's kind of at least the general pipeline, and it's evolved. It's been really fun we just get these free tools all the time, man. I don't know. I feel like every other month is Christmas because we're just sitting around running, we were running Llama 2, um, 13B, the Wizard LM. I don't know if you remember Wizard LM back in the day.
Yeah. I do.
It
Yeah,
was
yeah.
from Microsoft, they pulled it, but we were running that, and then Llama 3 came out, and we're like, "Alright, let's see, this seems smarter." Boom, and it was smaller and faster and smarter. What does that do to the ecosystem, right?
Sure.
I'm a tiny startup, we have a very small amount of funding and resources. Like, in your opinion, are you seeing it? Because you're tapped in, you're seeing people, startups like me, it's gotta have a massive ripple effect, right?
Dude, it's so funny because I think there is, on one hand, there is the you have to be almost, I'm not gonna say the cutting edge, but you have to be testing all of this stuff out in a way because you are resources constrained. And then I see there's another end of the spectrum where it's folks that are just trying to figure out the product itself. And once they figure out if they can make a product that someone loves, then they'll find out how to optimize on pricing and latency and all of that. And so you almost have two sides where there's the pricing insensitive, and so they say, "Whatever, we'll just throw everything at OpenAI or Claude because we want the best, and that's the least of our worries right now." And then you have this side where it's like, "I'm gonna fine tune everything that I can to our specific use case and throw a lot of, different models together and make it," and also, like, what you're doing with the databases and you're doing with how you're architecting things, it is so cool to see because it shows the possibility of what's out there.
Let me ask you a question, it's kind of a tangent, but
Yeah.
I've been wondering lately, the pricing of OpenAI, because you mentioned, "Oh, okay, the pricing's going down and down and down, so why don't I
Uh,
just use that?" And for sure, we use it, don't get me wrong, like I said, to label our data, we use GPT-4o and Claude, and, for doing the high level forecast, we'll run those through those because it makes sense, they're very smart. But I'm really scared as a startup about this pricing going down trend because I don't think that that's how it's I think this is a race to the bottom of these companies willing to take a ton of debt, so to subsidize those prices. What happens as soon as that fruit cake is done? All of a sudden, what do we do? Now the
yeah.
prices go up, and all of these businesses that, like mine even, I'm worried about, that have been exposed to a $2.5 per million GPT-4o token price and said, "I can build around that and build a real product," and then I start charging customers based on that ground level.
Mm.
All of a sudden, in 2 years, if we're lucky, and the gravy train's over, all of a sudden, OpenAI is finally all of these companies say, "Listen, we can't do it anymore. All of our
Can't
investors,
compete.
Sequoia's wants
Yeah.
their money back. Microsoft's but now it's gonna start ticking up, right?
Yeah.
And then that's just gonna put pressure on us. Do you think that's gonna happen, or can you alleviate some of my concerns?
Yeah, it does feel a little bit like the days of the ride sharing when the ride sharing first came out, right? And
Exactly.
you had lots of subsidized rides just to get people taking Uber and making it their go-to. And then now if you look, Uber is not cheaper than a taxi. That's for sure. So it does kind of have that, and especially when you hear things like OpenAI lost 5 billion and they made 3 billion. And you're like, well, why did they lose so much money? Oh, maybe it's because they were subsidizing the inference. But that's what is it? The elephant in the room that I haven't heard a lot of people talking about. And so you could be right. I hope you're wrong. And I hope what happens is that we just continue to get you build that muscle of using open source models so much that by the time Llama 5 comes out, you're like, yeah, I don't even need OpenAI. Or if I do need to hit an API, it's not really going to make a nominal difference on the cost because ideally the majority of the businesses are maturing with the market and they understand. So that's my look at it. But I do think that there's the race to the bottom. The other thing that I was gonna say is they can't go down forever. got to be a stopping point.
Yeah.
And that's what it's like when you have a running race and you have the finish line, and you know how if you do it mathematically, every time you go from point A to point B and then you cut it in half, that could go on for infinity. But in reality, at some point, you cross the finish line. And that's what it feels like. In reality, it feels like at some point, we're going to hit a stage where you can't go lower because it just, what are you going to do? Charge free? That doesn't work.
No, I'm scared. I think, and I like what you said about building that open source muscle, and we're trying our. I think we're prepared. But yeah, I look at some clients who want to use these high level derivatives for a certain price, and I'm thinking, like one guy said, I want a 2-year contract. I cannot forecast that far of OpenAI's pricings, and so.
That's hard.
But no, the other part of the the pricing of inference, the data itself is gonna get more expensive, okay?
Mm,
And because that gravy train is also coming to a very abrupt end, as you've probably watched the whole Perplexity, OpenAI legal fights between publishers, and
yeah.
they're signing up with platforms, they're fighting others. The cost of true good data is only gonna go up from here. And I think you've maybe seen on LinkedIn, there are ads now for just like make $1,600 a week doing coding problems to make training data for us, right? I like that. I like the premise. I like what they're after. It's like pay someone to generate your data, get the data you want. It makes sense. But that doesn't equate to a $2.5 GPT-4o $1 million token. I'm
No,
sorry, it doesn't
that's
add up.
expensive. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a very expensive one. Actually, I just saw that Uber opened up its gig economy, or things that you can do as an Uber contractor. You can now give rides, you can deliver food, and you can label data. That is their next frontier.
Interesting.
So that's pretty wild. And then on the other side, you see LinkedIn that is trying to just farm the data by saying, you're an expert in this field. Why don't you answer this question? And in that, I have my favorite person that I follow on LinkedIn is this guy who just blatantly gives the wrong answers to all of those. So he's completely trying to data poison him.
I
And you
really
read
don't
through
like
and it's
that
like,
system.
yeah. But you kind of read the answers and you go, this might make it pass. Like this might actually work, you know? It's not like you kind of have to read it and know that he is data poisoning
Mm, I like
for
that.
you to understand what's going on. So, yeah, that's, the LinkedIn LLM that comes out, I'm not gonna have much trust in because of that guy.
Makes sense. I mean, even LinkedIn data itself having value, maybe their LLM is going to be trash, but a lot of some of our competitors are companies like Exa, and I'm seeing these business models crop up, and I think I'm missing something, and I want you to tell me what I'm missing. But the business model of Exa is we scrape the entire web without any concern, including LinkedIn, including Threads, including Instagram, and deliver it to you and structure it for you. And actually, the
Mm,
tech is quite interesting. I like what they're doing. I think that it's very
yeah.
compelling. But how is it a sustainable business model when LinkedIn is going to be like, "Nah, I'm good. You're not going to scrape our stuff anymore," right?
Yeah,
How how is that a strong business model?
yeah, and even X charging for API usage. And so all of a sudden you're now every time you're hitting an API, you're doing that. And that is one of the biggest questions that I had for you is like, isn't it too long? Because I'm assuming all of the news sources that you're getting are when it's published on a blog or a publication. And so isn't there too long of a gap between when something happens and when it gets published? Or I know the gap is very short, but for someone to actually write something and then push publish is much different than me sending out a tweet.
This is an awesome discussion. I'm really enjoying this one. Um, there's different timescales of business insight, okay? And
Uh-huh.
let's take forecasting, for example. Typically, forecasting is not the next 10 minutes in event forecasting, where you're saying you want to forecast if Pete Hegseth is going to be removed as the nominee from for the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah.
And that requires quite a lot of information into the archive, actually, not even just the current. You do want the latest data points for sure, because that helps you project forward. But understanding how those data points developed is equally important, if not even sometimes more, especially if you're saying something like, what is the S&P 500? Is the S&P 500 going to close higher or lower in 2025? That
For
doesn't really require the last tweet from Warren Buffett.
no,
It requires
maybe
really
from
building
Elon.
out an understanding of what the Fed is doing, an understanding of the global economy, and like a very high level contextual picture, which we can now do with LLMs, which is insane. And so that's a resolution where having 5-minute information up to the last 5-minute news is very useful. But like you said, if you're like, w- actually, the best example is, yeah, a lot of prediction market users use us, but they can't use us for every prediction market because of what you just said. There are certain prediction markets where we're very usable, and there are certain prediction markets where we're completely useless because they depend only on what happens on Twitter, and only you need to be basically tracking Twitter and it be the fastest to click to get the right prediction market price,
Uh-huh.
versus that Pete Hegseth example where you can make it 8 days in advance, 10 days in advance, and do research. And so just seeing that there's that variety is really interesting. We like to specialize in structuring the news. We have a lot of analysts and uh, firms like Love Justice using us for those sorts of investigations, but there
Yeah.
are certainly applications where we're not the right one, and I like that.
Uh-huh.
I even think that it would make sense for us to reach out to another service that maybe specializes only in Twitter, right? I mean, we could use the Twitter API, and we have some development on that, but maybe there's a better service that can really structure it in a more retrievable way, the way we do it with news, but they're focused. So
Yeah,
there's
then
just
you
different use
plug that in
cases.
to your service, and so you do have that real time. But I do like one thing that is clear, just like, as we were talking with, about MEM Graph, right? MEM Graph took steps and it made decisions on how they were gonna do things. And it feels like you've done the same, and you said, "We are going to create our product for these use cases, and right now, we aren't even gonna worry about those use cases that need to be real time, and the latest, tweets about whatever, or the latest posts. If it's breaking news, that isn't necessarily where the strong value comes in. It comes in more on the understanding of how the whole plays together."
Exactly. And there's also some consideration of factuality, right? If it's just
Yeah.
bumped to Twitter, there's a strong chance it might actually be untrue. Some of our analysts really want us to track Telegram channels,
Oh, I was gonna
um,
say that too.
and you
Yeah,
can do it.
especially, like, Ukraine war.
Exactly. That's where a lot of the real latest information comes from. But there's a lot of misinformation there too, or not even misinformation, but just they're not sure what occurred. They're speculating. It's speculation, and it shouldn't necessarily be written down as news. Just the fact that someone had to sit down and verify that this is something we want to put on a server as a news article, it gives it that additional level of credibility. Again, RT is doing it, so we take that a bit with a grain of salt, but
Uh-huh.
there's
Uh-huh.
something to be said for that difference in publishing versus just a 200 character tweet or a message on Telegram. So I think that using that context smartly is good. We do have, I think it would be really smart, like Camel AI. I don't know if you've heard of them.
No.
They're an agentic multi-agent framework. They're playing with letting multi-agents make each other and make more agents and then talk to each other and then come back, and it's wild. And they just have a bunch of tools. To me, that really is the solution. Ask News is one tool that one of the agents might want to use, but then you have a Twitter tool, and then it can define that contextual picture, can say, this is the news, this is the Twitter, be careful, right? This is just Twitter. Let's use it for what it is and paint that contextual picture. I think that might be a good way. And maybe in the future we end up going the route of expanding. But I think you're right that as a startup, we're really focused on getting news right. Yeah.
One thing that you're doing is you're giving the whole picture, and you're giving both sides, and maybe some of these sides of the picture, me as a consumer, I wouldn't necessarily go and seek out, but I am, or I like to think of myself as open-minded, and I don't want to just read stuff that is coming from an echo chamber. And so I appreciate different viewpoints. And now, how are you making sure that the stuff that you're grabbing isn't just fake news? Is it because you have a good solid graph of it and you can see?
That's part of it. There's a lot of human in the loop. We have an editor on staff, an editor in chief who is in our staff. He was editor of the Rocky Mountain News for 20 years, right? So this is someone who takes this seriously. There's a lot of human review of the data, a human review of the output, human review of what sources we're tracking. You know, if you submit a Substack and it's clearly just complete and utter trash, we won't include it. But it's usually where our standards will allow a lot to come in, not really. But because and only because once you get to the point where you're painting the picture as a user or as us, we are the user of our own service in some ways.
Yeah.
Um, you can really make strong decisions of how to put competing perspectives against each other. And like I said, you can filter on objective reporting voice.
Yeah.
You can detect when the voice of what was written was trying to evoke emotion. And that is
Mm.
a strong indicator that this is probably, there may be interesting details there, but that's an indicator that maybe we should leave this source with less credibility. You can even still pass it to the LLM, but you can just say, label this is sensational, right?
Uh-huh.
And now treat the sensational sources as they should be treated with less credibility. It's a big gray zone of how you can approach that problem. It's a big experiment, to be completely frank. Like the front page of Ask News, that is where we do that high level clustering. We're using our own service on the back end, but we're writing our own work, which is bringing in the Chinese, Japanese, French, all of the different perspectives in one. And that has been, when we started, we didn't know if it would work very well. But what we've noticed over the past year, we've been tracking the Israel-Palestinian conflict, which is maybe the
Uh-huh.
most polemic topic that currently exists. And every time we write an article, well, not every time, but many times I'll look at one and I'll say, I'm going to send this to someone I know who is very pro-Israel and just ask them for their opinion. And
Yeah.
I'm going to send this to someone who's very pro-Gaza and just ask them for the opinion. And honestly, they always come back and say that's a decent representation, because the way that it reports is following these editorial standards of, well, according to the
Yeah.
uh, the health ministry of Palestine, this is what happened. And that's kind of what an Israel reader wants to see, right? Because they want to know what that health ministry is saying. And as long as you say that's who said it, this is where the information came from, it's up to a pro-Israel person to decide if they trust it or not. And same with the Gaza side. If, oh, the government of Israel has said, Benjamin Netanyahu came out and said, this is what happened. Well, at least it's being reported in that fashion, and then the contradictions are painted, right? It's okay. The Israel government says this, the Palestinian government says this, and this is the contradiction.
That's it.
Take it or leave it, right? And at no point did we say anything in this was fact. Nothing was true,
Yeah.
nothing was false. But we said, these are where the alignments are. Believe it or not, a lot of times the Israel, the stuff coming out of the Israel government actually aligns with some of the stuff coming out of the Gazan health ministry, because a lot of the facts are indisputable about where the thing occurred, right? There are journalists on the ground, there are pictures, there's a lot of aerial evidence. So the key alignments are very nice to see, and I think that helps those people when I send the polemic topics out. So I'm not saying we're solving it, but we definitely have found a very unique contextual representation. And the final point of evidence for this methodology, one of our other favorite client is the University of Texas, and
Uh-huh.
they're doing research into misinformation detection. And their new method, CrediRag, is a RAG-based credibility system based on Ask News, but also using some wild techniques of building out social graphs between who said what and why when they said it. And but Ask News is this key component, and they're finding that this is working really well, bringing in competing perspectives for this. Basically, they take a Reddit post that might be misinformation, and they
Yeah.
search Ask News database to get all of the diversified viewpoints, and then they pass that plus the Reddit to an LLM, and you can classify it. You can say,
Wow.
okay, what does this seem to be misinformation? Does it seem to not be? And that works very well. Their accuracy is up to like 95% on the detection, which is up 25% from the previous state of the art. So that's a really fun validation. I love bragging about it. I appreciate you giving me the moment for that. But
Yeah, of course. It's so cool to see, and I'm a firm believer that there's almost like 3 sides to every story, your side, my side, and the truth is somewhere in between there. So,
exactly.
this, in a way, is how you can get both sides of the story, and you see where it matches up, and then you see where the narratives take different turns, for better, for worse. So that's super cool that you give that, because I like your friends that you're sending these articles to want to feel like I'm at least getting the other side of the story. Whether or not I believe it, that's my choice, or whether or not I choose to support it, I guess, less than believe it is, do I want to support that argument or another argument? But I want to at least know, what are both of these arguments?
Exactly.
And something that I was thinking about too, are you using podcasts? Because it feels like that podcast transcripts could be a good news source too.
We are looking into. We have in the development environment YouTube transcripts, but the legality of going public with it is the main blocker right now. Um,
Uh,
there's a lot of you got to be very careful with how you use YouTube data because they're not really designed to be freely scraped like that.
yeah.
So, yeah, I think we would probably need to sign up individual podcasts to really get them in, but there's so much good information being transacted on podcasts. I completely agree. Even in news YouTube videos themselves, I think you probably know of DW, right? Y- Uh, the German one. I find them to be very, matter of fact, straight, and I would love to get that information as another competing perspective from their YouTube videos, but the scraping YouTube legality is one that's a bit hard to handle.
Interesting. Well, man, this has been fascinating. Before we go, I have to ask, because you kind of talked about it back when we were mentioning the ontology. You said the way that you're doing no ontology is beneficial in some ways, but you said for other ways it's not beneficial. What are the other ways for those people that
Yeah.
have sat with us for this whole conversation? At least give them some kind of payoff and let them know what the other side of the story is, because I know that that is also important. Like, we can't paint it out to be all roses and tie dye, right?
Yeah. A lot harder to handle more data. It'll become slower to do your traversals. It'll be and not only that, but harder to formulate your query in some ways, depending on if you're going to stick with this very free flowing of ontology freeness. You can't really your queries are harder to build because you don't have a definition a priori in order to decide how that query should propagate. So that would be the biggest limitation. However, with the raw data, and like I said, then moving into a MEM graph, you can use our metadata to build it out. It's just a matter of deciding what you need. But communicating to LLMs, I find that to be the biggest difference. Is like the strength of the ontology is querying and being able to extract insights that way and getting really directly to where you need to go in that graph, even using node to vec in order to predict links and stuff like that, doing things that are very, very creative. Um, but passing really highly resolved information to an LLM to extract that might be where there's a slight weakness. So that would be, I think, the give and take.